Okay, good evening. My name is Jan Blau, and I'm from New York City. I'm not a professional historian, but I have taken a very sharp interest in George Washington for 15 years or so, and I just can't read enough about him, and they're always writing something about him, so there's always something new about him and the other founders, and he was obviously a veteran of the Continental Army, along with Alexander Hamilton. Tonight, I'll touch on why he wanted to be the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and that would be a short biography of Washington, and then I'll do a short biography, I guess, of Hamilton and their relationship and their breakup and coming back together. So I began to be interested in George Washington. I grew up with Lyndon Johnson being the president, and I thought he was a great guy, and then he lost his way with Vietnam, and a big multi-volume biography came out, which punctured his balloon a little bit, but I still think he was a great president with Medicaid and Medicare and the Civil Rights Act of '64, et cetera. But then I began to look at the other presidents and who was a great president. And I came to Washington. You know, you always look, well, where's the bad stuff? And with Washington, you know, you never get to the bad stuff. And that impressed me, and I grew up with my own father, I guess I should mention, on Veterans Day, served in World War II in Okinawa, an island of death. It had a very negative effect on him. War has a negative effect on the soldiers and the injured, dead, the families. So George Washington grew up obviously in Northern Virginia, and he grew up under difficult circumstances. And the difficult circumstance was that he had an extremely difficult mother. And who he was really has to do later with why he became a military man. His mother has been described by various historians as self-centered, stern, stubborn, querulous, uncooperative, demanding, cantankerous, anxious, crusty. But when you add it all up, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist, but in my opinion, Mary Blau Washington had a personality defect, a severe personality defect. And I have some evidence of that, which is in your handout, and that is this letter of George Washington of May 18th, 1974. This is President Washington writing to his nephew, Robert Lewis, about this very important tract of land. Now, I want to make clear that I think that everything that happened to Washington was great for us because we had a great first president, and his problems, and it all worked out for us. Now, this letter in 1794 is regarding this tract of land, and it says it was left to her, speaking of his deceased mother, by her father, Blau. But what his Christian name was, I am unable to tell you. George Washington did not know the first name of his grandfather, his mother's father. It's extraordinary. What person doesn't know the first name of their grandfather? And it also means George Washington's father died when he was 11. it also means that his father couldn't get the name of his father-in-law, of his wife's father, from his wife. So this is a level of uncooperation, which is, it's not normal. It's just, whatever you want to classify, this is what the mother that George Washington grew up with. And it was very difficult for him. Now, the mother not only had a severe personality defect, but really her impact was such that, in my opinion, Washington came from a destroyed home. The father, Augustine Washington, basically, if you look at his comings and goings, he stayed away from the household, leaving George. George was the first child of the second marriage. So he left George and the younger siblings with this very, very difficult mother, while he made a 6-month trip to England on one occasion, and he had other land, which he, I imagine, wasn't there very much. And one historian has pointed out that in the tens of thousands of letters, diary entries, etc., that Washington made in his life, he only mentions his father like 3 little times. So one gets the feeling that Washington was miffed at his father for leaving him with this extremely difficult mother. So Washington lived in 3 places. He lived on birthplaces closer to the Atlantic Ocean on the Potomac. And then he was 6. The father moved the family up the Potomac to what is now Mount Vernon. And when Washington is 6, who appears on the scene but his savior, his older half-brother, Lawrence. Lawrence had finished his education in England and now returned to Northern Virginia. Lawrence was 20 years old. George was 6. And it was, they bonded. And Lawrence became the most important person in George Washington's life until he married Martha, and then I suppose you could say it was kind of even. So Lawrence, we have to take a step back now to learn something about George Washington and Lawrence Washington, and that is the English Civil War. In the English Civil War, the Roundheads, the parliamentary Roundheads, they were called, with that funny bowl-shaped haircut, defeated the forces of Charles I and chopped off his head. The Roundheads disparagingly called the Royalists Cavaliers. And the Royalists liked that term. Yes, we're Cavaliers. Now, Cavalier today means, has that common meaning of, nonchalance or whatever. But it also means a Cavalier is this person. That is a military man, a well-dressed military man who is a man of honor. And he fights for a just cause as a man of honor. So this was the Royalists reestablished the monarchy with Charles II. But during that time, when the parliamentarians were in charge and they were killing some of the Royalists, some of the Royalists fled, and some of them came to Northern Virginia. And Washington's great-great-grandfather, for instance, lost his job as an Anglican minister at Oxford because he was, a supporter of the monarch. So now today, we do have that term. Virginia Cavaliers is the mascot name. I think the University of Virginia, maybe there's a pro basketball team, but the Virginia Cavaliers lives on. And Lawrence comes here, and then a short time later, Lawrence, unfortunately for George, joins the British expedition against the Spanish in the Caribbean. And this, of course, is the Cavalier tradition, military adventure to bring honor and glory. Unfortunately, the British expedition failed at Cartagena, and Lawrence never got off the boat. But he did meet the admiral in charge of the Navy. There was a split in the British tradition, which still exists between the Army and the Navy. But Admiral Vernon took Lawrence Washington onto his flagship. And that was very helpful to Lawrence, because flagship crewmen had, with their experience, had better immunity. And so these terrible shipboard-borne diseases, the experienced seamen with their better immunity was a better place to be. And of course, the food was better on the flagship, and the alcohol, etc. When Lawrence came back, his father had given him what we know today as Mount Vernon. The father loved his firstborn son, and he loved George too, but one sees that he loved Lawrence because he grew up with Lawrence. And when he came back, Lawrence, he discovered that just to the south of what we call Mount Vernon, there was a new neighbor in the state called Belvoir, and that neighbor was William Fairfax. And Lawrence came back and was attracted to the 15-year-old daughter of his new neighbor and married later that year. Unfortunately, that year, which was 1752, I think. No, not 52. let me get it. (1743), when Washington is 11, the father dies, but nevertheless, Lawrence marries the daughter, Anne Fairfax. It must have been a grand marriage. And unfortunately, Lawrence came back with malaria, and the malaria weakened him, and he came down with what we know today as tuberculosis. And he took George to Barbados to have better weather, and Washington actually came down with smallpox in Barbados, and he had a few pock marks on his face, but he had a lifelong immunity from smallpox. Now, for many years, I thought that was, and everybody thinks that, or many people think that was the cause of Washington's infertility, because he never had children. But I have since become aware that Washington also came down with tuberculosis. Washington had a slight depression to his chest, and that is a symptom of tuberculosis, and it wouldn't be surprising if Washington had tuberculosis, because Lawrence died of tuberculosis, and he was with Lawrence on the boat, in the rooms. So Washington, I believe, had both smallpox and tuberculosis, and one of them rendered him infertile. So after Lawrence came back himself, he then passed away, and Lawrence, George was about 20. So the thing is that at that moment, Washington seeks to join the Virginia militia. He comes from an unhappy home life, and Washington was never really that close to his younger sister, Betty or his younger brothers. There was nothing bad between them. But, for instance, there's like no record of Betty or the other three younger brothers visiting Commander-in-Chief Washington at any of the many places where he was the Commander-in-Chief during the 8 years of the war. And there's really no record of them visiting Mount Vernon. So he did visit with them, but it was not, wasn't really a family type of a thing. Of course, the mother ruined the whole family, in my opinion. So Washington, at the age of 20, is allowed to join. He gets a leadership position because he becomes a Fairfax man, Washington. And he gets a leadership position in the Virginia militia, and he stays in the Virginia militia for years. So, and then he's sent by the governor of Virginia to tell the French to get out, and they don't go. Then he's sent to throw them out, and he's second in command, but the first in command dies, and then Washington becomes the leader of it, and that is the start of the French and Indian War. Now, Washington himself was not a violent man. If you look at, say, President Andrew Jackson, General Andrew Jackson, who was always engaging in duels, that was a guy who, you could see there was a lot of violence there. But Washington never engaged in a duel, and there was no violence, personal violence. But in my opinion, what Washington found as a soldier was the camaraderie of the men. You were there with the others, sleeping together, eating together, fighting together, talking together. At night, you drink together. One of the old soldiers would sing some war song, and another would tell a war story, and that's what Washington liked. So finally, now I didn't mention it before, but Washington, in my opinion, had trouble having close relationships with men and women. There really are no close friends to George Washington. And I believe part of it is that, you reveal yourself to a friend. Washington liked to drink that Madeira wine. He also liked beer. But Madeira wine is fortified with alcohol, so it travels very nicely. And it gives you a nice buzz. But anyway, the point is, he never revealed himself. He didn't want to talk about his mother, his father, his upbringing. I have the impression he wanted to talk about horses, he wanted to talk about dogs, he wanted to talk about tobacco, he wanted to talk about politics, but there was never any closeness that comes about, when you talk about, personal things, your father hit you, or you beat up your brother, or, nobody ever said one night, Washington this, or Washington told me this or that. It doesn't exist. So there was this issue of closeness. And Washington had an issue of closeness with women. There are no women in Washington's life. He writes a letter to like a rich guy that he's interested in his daughter, but now Washington was a very good dancer, but he didn't, so he went to the Sunday, they had the dances, and he went to the dances and danced, and he was a great dancer. But he just didn't know how to make that little flirtatious conversation, to put his arm around a woman's shoulder, or etc., hold her hand. So what happened with Washington was that Martha Washington became aware of him somehow, because he was well known. He was really the leading military man of Virginia. And she sent what we call today a honey trap for him. And she was the honey. He was coming back from Williamsburg back to Mount Vernon, and he had to take a certain path, which she figured out. And all of this was a secret, and it didn't become revealed until 100 years later, when her grandson revealed it in his memoirs. But Washington was crossing the Pamunkey River, in a ferry. The ferries were on private property, and the owner of the private property came out and said, Major Washington, would you join me for dinner? Washington said, I'm too busy. And he said, look, Martha Parke Custis, who was the richest widow in Virginia and probably the colonies, is going to be there too, please, please. So Washington gave in, and his body servant, his body slave, said, should I take the saddles off, like we're going to stay a long time, or should I leave the saddles on for a quick getaway? Washington supposedly said, leave the saddles on. They have the dinner. Washington will end up staying till the next morning. They have the dinner, and then Washington finds himself alone with Martha Parke Custis, who was a widow and mother of two, and that was the start of their relationship. So he came back a week later. They really became engaged, but they kept the engagement a secret. Why exactly? But that's what they did. And then he came back several months later, and that's it. They met 3 times. Then in December of that year, when he was 26, he resigns from the Virginia militia, and a few weeks later, in January, he marries Martha Parke Custis. And then they moved down to Mount Vernon. But again, my point is that Washington had trouble relating to people, women and men, but when he said goodbye to the Virginia militia, they wrote him a beautiful letter. Oh, we thank you, sir, for your fairness, for your leadership. We'll always remember you as, what a great guy, and we were so, this kind of language. And Washington responded in a letter, which I really should include in the handout, but I haven't. And he said, thanks for your thanks. In this I glory. In other words, he gloried in the camaraderie of the men. Washington wasn't really, it was more the camaraderie of the officers than it was of the whole army. Washington believed in the distance between officers and the common soldier. So now he becomes an ordinary citizen of Virginia. Washington always loved the land, the crops. But of course, what he's interested in is children. Now, there's nothing in writing that says this, but it's just the most natural thing that a now 27-year-old married man, strong and virile as George Washington, would want to have children. But now they discover that there's no babies coming. And of course, they know from the animals, the horses, the dogs, they know from, the poor enslaved people, how, periods of fertility, and there's no children coming. So Washington never writes, that he's disappointed, but one just has to assume that he was disappointed. Martha had given birth to 4 children, and 2 of them survived, and 2 of them died more in infancy. But the point is, 4 births is a lot of fertility. And here there was nothing or no fertility. So Washington is just leading a kind of an ordinary life there in Virginia. He's not a leader of the House of Burgesses. He gets elected, but he's not a leader. And House of Burgesses meets in Williamsburg. And, you know, there's a season there when the House of Burgesses is in session. There are parties and, you know, all kinds of other things that, you know, rich people do, gambling and horse racing and, of course, fox hunts. But the conflict is going on with England, and Washington is, you know, involved in it on the side, of course, constantly of the cause, the revolution. And now two significant things happen. One of them is that his neighbors, the Fairfaxes, the son of William Fairfax was named George Fairfax. He was older than George Washington, and he was kind of a nerd. But he was married to Sally Fairfax, that George had a major league crush on. And the crush went nowhere. Sally married George Fairfax, and George married Martha. And the two couples became best friends. They were neighbors and best friends. But now George Fairfax wanted to inherit his uncle's tract of land. There's a vast tract of land. And in order to do that, he had to stay a loyalist. And they left and went to England. They went back home to England. And this was a big blow to George Washington. He never got over Sally Fairfax. And in fact, he not only wrote this love letter before he married Martha, he then wrote to Sally Fairfax after her husband died and said, come back, you know, it'll be nice for you. And he wrote in the letter, unfortunately, the home, that wonderful mansion, Belvoir, had burnt down. And Washington writes, oh, I was so sad to visit Belvoir, where I spent the happiest days of my life. So he's not saying the happiest days of his life are with Martha. The happiest days of his life were dancing with Sally at Belvoir as a young man. But Sally never came back, but she saved the letters. And in the 1890s, her estate revealed that they had this letter, the love letter especially, from Washington, and it became a big scandal. And I think J.P. Morgan bought the letter to quiet the whole thing up. But that was a big blow to Washington to lose his best friends. Now, also, another thing that happened is that Martha's daughter died. Patsy was the nickname for Martha. So Patsy had seizures, and she died in 1773. So now Martha's son also died right after the Yorktown. And Washington writes in his diary, the son was a very difficult stepson. And, you know, very difficult, and gave George Washington a hard time, you know, his whole life. So he just puts in his diary, you know, he doesn't really care. But when Patsy dies at the age of 17, oh, poor Patsy died. You could see the emotional attachment that he had to Patsy. So now two things have happened. The Fairfaxes have left, and Patsy has died. He has no kids. And now the revolution is proceeding, and he gets elected to the Continental Congress, and then there's a second Continental Congress, and in 1775, and he shows up with his Virginia militia uniform, blue and buff. But it's not his old uniform. He's had a new uniform made. He's a Cavalier. They don't go wearing a 10-year-old uniform. So here he is. You know, he's over 6'2", and he looks great. He's got the Virginia reputation. And they select him to be the commander-in-chief. And later on, it comes out that he tells his friend, now look, I want you to be a witness that I didn't seek this office, okay? They sought me, okay? But it was a little absurd. There he is, the only guy in a uniform. He's a military guy. And, but that's the way he was. A man of honor, doesn't seek the office. The office seeks him. So he becomes the commander, and he goes up to Boston. The Battle of Bunker Hill has already taken place. He gets there afterwards. And he then authorizes Knox. Knox goes and gets these big cannons from Fort Ticonderoga. It was great what Knox did, bringing the cannons back. And then Washington gets them up to the heights over the Boston Harbor, and the British wake up, and they're looking at the big guns, which could blow up their ships. And a few days later, they say, you know what, we're going to leave. But if you blow up our ships, we're going to burn the town. So that's the deal. And they all lived up to the deal, and the British sailed away. And Washington was a great hero, but the war hadn't even begun. So then the next phase in the war, we introduce Alexander Hamilton. The next phase, of course, happens in New York. And Alexander Hamilton was born in the Caribbean, and it seems like he was a poor kid, and his mother died in the same bed where he was sick. And he had his father, left the family, but it's not clear at all that Hamilton, who was nominally his father, was in fact his father. His mother, Rachel, was obviously a very superior woman and a little excessively sexual for the time. So she left her husband, a guy named Levine, and he wouldn't divorce her, so Alexander Hamilton was conceived outside of marriage. And then eventually she died. And the evil stepfather came down and grabbed her whole estate. But it could be there was another man who was supposed to be Hamilton's close friend, but bore a remarkable resemblance to Hamilton. And a man saw them here in New York. He saw the Hamilton, and he said, this has to be his brother. So it might be that Hamilton had a rich father who remained undisclosed, and that's where, because when he came to New York, he had a good amount of funds. Supposedly the funds were raised for him, but it may be that his undisclosed father actually provided him with those funds. So Hamilton was a brilliant guy. He was really like a genius. Washington was a smart guy, but nobody ever said he was a genius. Excuse me. So Hamilton and another guy organized an independent artillery corps. And they got the artillery by stealing them from the British, further down at the tip of Manhattan. And then basically Washington and the Continental Army came down from Boston. And as they came down, they kind of brought everybody, these independent type of artillery and independent army units under the umbrella of the Continental Army. So the British come, they take Long Island, they cross to Manhattan, then they, the American Army, the Continental Army has to slip away up the West Side. And one writer says that it was Aaron Burr who ordered Hamilton to go up the West Side. Aaron Burr had like a higher position. But the Continental Army got away nicely to Harlem Heights, then to Westchester, and Hamilton was now part of the Army. Then what happened was a mistake was made. There was a Fort Washington up there, like 180th Street, right by the Hudson River. And General Greene got into his head that they could defend it. And so they didn't have to evacuate it. Washington he left it up to Greene. And unfortunately, Greene was wrong, and the local commanders, Greene wasn't alone in the whole thing, but the British and the Hessians took Fort Washington in a couple of days of fighting, and they captured almost 3,000 men. It was a terrible blow to the Continental Army. And Washington was here in Fort Lee, or a little north of Fort Lee, and Cornwallis crosses over the Hudson, goes up the Palisades, and they were trying to capture Washington. But Washington told his subordinates, let's instantly leave everything and instantly let's get out of here. And they left their tents, but they did get away. And Washington realized he had a shadow of an army where in the New York area they had maybe 15,000 men. At one point it was counted and they were down to 3,000. So Washington heads south, and the British are behind him. And the British get criticized for not catching up to them, but it was early December now of 1776. And you always have to remember that the British and the Hessians, they were here cannonade going on. And this cannonade is so effective that the British are like stopped. So basically, Washington then says, like, who's responsible? It's not entirely clear, but he does comment on the cannonade, and the cannonade was provided by Alexander Hamilton's artillery. And when he meets Alexander Hamilton, Washington then says, please come into my headquarters. Now, the general term at that time for generals, the group at headquarters, was his military family. Washington didn't invent the term, but there it is, really, what I was saying before, that Washington was disappointed in his own family life. And he turned to the army for the camaraderie of the men. And there was openly, it was a family, a military family. So Washington was very into written documents. He got up in the morning, he did his correspondence every morning. Tremendous, all of these letters survive, and he's getting out of line. He wanted what he called pen men. So they would anticipate what he was writing, and they would write it, and then he would just sign it. And Alexander Hamilton was instantly great at that. So Hamilton came into the headquarters in the military family and worked very nicely with all of the other aides de camp that Washington had. There was no conflict or anything. Hamilton had no family himself. I mean, this is a common reason that men and women join the military even today, right? Because they're disconnected from their families one way or the other, and they want to be connected. So they head south, and then they get to, of course, eventually they escape to the other side of the Delaware River, and on December 26th, they attack, crossing and beating the Hessians at Trenton in a great victory. And Hamilton, he had his artillery there. At the top of two streets, one is King, one is Queen, and the artillery blasted the Hessians. The Hessians tried to get their artillery piece going, and remarkably, somebody said, you got to stop him. And James Monroe, who would become our president, and a cousin of Washington's, whose name was William Washington, they just ran down the hill in a suicide mission and broke up the Hessians from setting up their artillery piece. Just as an aside, Monroe was one of the lead men in the attack, and a certain doctor came out there in the outskirts of Trenton and said, who are you? We're Americans. Oh, you're Americans, I'm going to join you. And then when Monroe took the shot over here, like near his heart, near his, one of those major arteries, the doctor was right there and stuck his finger right at the point where Monroe was hemorrhaging and saved his life. So Hamilton wanted really the glory of a field command, but he was there at headquarters helping Washington, and of course he had great adventures, Hamilton. In effect, he became the second in the chief of staff. Okay, he became the chief of staff, but it was no tension with the other guys. So by and by, Hamilton, the fighting. Let me just look at my notes here. What happens is that after the Battle of Trenton, and then there was a second Battle of Trenton, then there was the Battle of Princeton, the British realized that New Jersey was dangerous, and they had spread out their forts into units of 1,500, because if there was too high a concentration of men, then it would be hard on the local community to provide hay for the horses and food for the men. But that was a mistake, because there wasn't enough men at Trenton to stop Washington. But now all of New Jersey became dangerous, and the British would always be hungry there in New York City, and they'd have to bring food and hay all the way across the Atlantic. Now, the French come into the war, and the British take Philadelphia, and the French come into the war, and we're going to fast forward now to Valley Forge, and von Steuben there comes to Valley Forge and teaches the American men about maneuvering and marching and, turning and different kinds of commands, which was very effective. And now the battle, as the British decide to consolidate in New York, and they're leaving Philadelphia, and Washington and his generals decide to attack the rear guard of the British. But the British were waiting for them, and they put their best troops in the battle. That's what they wanted. It was a big battle. So there's a standoff there at Monmouth. There's really a standoff. The British, Lee was supposed to, Charles Lee led the attack, but the British were very powerful, and Lee retreated from the men. Washington got very mad at him. It's not really entirely clear whether or not Lee had done the best he could, because he didn't want to attack them at all. He had said so at the councils of war, just let them go back to New York. But here the British were attacking, and Washington rallied the different men, including Lee and the von Steuben, and they formed the defenses, and then the artillery, but not so much led by Hamilton, but by another French artilleryman, had very sophisticated artillery, and there was an artillery duel. It was very hot that day, June 28th, the Battle of Monmouth, and the men were dropping from the heat, And but Washington won the field, and the British that night, after fighting, went back to New York by ship, and it was really considered at the time a great victory at Monmouth. And unfortunately, since then, the historians have reduced the victory to a draw, but I still think it was a victory. So now, after the Battle of Monmouth, the British are really, that's the last big battle in the North, and the British are staying there in New York, and that's the last fighting in the North. Now the British decide the third phase of the war was in the South, and the British initially won battles in the South, and then at a certain point in, let's see, so in February of 1780, when the war, the Battle of Monmouth had taken place in 1778, and there's no fighting. There's very little fighting, practically none. And so the winter now in the Continental Army is a party time because there's no fighting, and the wives are coming, and it's a good time. And handsome Alexander Hamilton meets Elizabeth Schuyler in February of 1780. So there's coming a break. There's coming a break between Hamilton and Washington. But the break happens after Hamilton meets Elizabeth Schuyler. He had no other family. Now he has Elizabeth, and of course Schuyler. Elizabeth Schuyler is the daughter of Major General Daniel Schuyler and the whole rich Schuyler family from Albany, New York. So the story of the break between Hamilton and Washington is that Hamilton is like at the bottom of the stairs and he's talking to Lafayette. Hamilton and Lafayette were very close. Hamilton spoke French. And of course, Lafayette spoke French. And then there was a third one. You could say they were the Three Musketeers, but now we know to call them the Three Cavaliers. So anyway, John Lawrence was the third. Unfortunately, he died right at the end of the Revolutionary War. But then Hamilton goes up the stairs to his meeting with Washington, and Washington is irritated. Now, Washington always tried to put on a nice public face, but privately, he was much more of an irritated guy. So Washington says, Hamilton, you've kept me waiting these 10, 15 minutes. And Hamilton then says, if that's how you feel, we must part. And he turns around and walks out. Washington realizes this is serious, and he sends some of the other guys to make nice. But Hamilton is determined to make a break. But he agrees with Washington that he'll stick around for like another few weeks, the way any employee would be. You have to know it on their desk, etc. So after another few weeks, there is a break, and Hamilton leaves. But he doesn't hand in his commission. He just leaves the army, and he's there, locally. In fact, Washington is there up in Westchester, and Hamilton is like in upstate New York at a little cottage built for two with his new wife. And then Hamilton gets word, and Washington marches south now from Westchester down to Yorktown. The Americans have won a great victory at Kings Mountain and also at Cowpens, South Carolina. The British had a strike force, a terrible British officer named Tarleton who was known at one point for not allowing, for taking no prisoners. He was the head of this strike force. And at Cowpens, our great Daniel Morgan set up a very clever defense because the militia was always running away. The regular troops would stand their ground more, but the militia would run as soon as battle started. So Morgan told the militia, fire 2 shots and then go to the rear. Okay, they can do it. So they all, the whole thing, the British saw that the Americans were like going to the rear. They thought, great, we're winning. But then the regulars got up and cut them down, and they wiped out the strike force. And that was really the final turning point of the war, because the loyalists in the South, previously at the Battle of, say, Monmouth, the loyalists in the North got the word, we're not safe. The British are not going to win. They're not going to hold territory. They're not going to protect us. Now, after the Battle of Cowpens, the same thing. The British are not winning. They're not protecting us. It's very stupid to be a loyalist. Either be a patriot, be neutral, keep your mouth shut, but don't be a loyalist. So now what happens after the Battle of Cowpens is that Cornwallis wanted to kind of get revenge on Morgan. And Morgan hooked up with Greene, and they chased each other around. Cornwallis was after Greene and Morgan, and he never could quite get his hands on him. But eventually, Cornwallis decided he had to go to the Atlantic, where the mighty British Navy was, because you could get safety and, resupply and be whisked to safety. And he was at Yorktown. And this is where, fortuitously, the French fleet was there, and the British fleet couldn't get through. And now Washington begins his march with Rochambeau to go down to Yorktown for the coup de grace, Yorktown. And Hamilton gets word of it, that the army is on the march. So he approaches Washington, and he says, look, I didn't, you made me into your headquarters guy. You made me into your pen guy. But I wanted the glory of a battlefield command. So why don't you let me get involved now? Now, there were 2 redoubts, little structures, not heavily built, but the British had 2 redoubts. And the redoubts had been taken in order to get the siege guns close enough to Yorktown. So even though Hamilton had not led troops for years, and he was an artillery guy, he wasn't a combat guy, he gave in to Hamilton. So that's the way Washington was. Even though Hamilton had, in effect, broken away from him, he didn't hold it against Hamilton. Now, Hamilton, Washington and Lafayette had a very close relationship. That was like his adopted stepson. It really came from Lafayette. I believe that Lafayette kind of won Washington over with those little French kisses, the 2 double kisses there, which, we don't do here, but Lafayette was doing, and Lafayette was friendly with everybody. The story is that when Washington arrived with Rochambeau and the American and the French troops, Lafayette was here first, and he was beside himself that this was it. After years of fighting, there's his adopted father, and there's his military leader, Rochambeau, and supposedly he kissed Washington from one side of his face to the other, right in front of everybody. And Washington just tolerated it, but really, Washington formed an emotional connection to Lafayette. So later on, John Adams said, because he became an enemy of Hamilton, he said, oh, Washington only gave Hamilton that glorious position to attack the redoubt because he blackmailed him. He knew dirt on Washington, and that's why he gave in. But there was no dirt. Anyway, Hamilton told his guys, we're going in with bayonets only. And they jumped the outside of the redoubts, whooping like American Indians, Native Americans. And the British thought, wow, it's too many of them, and they surrendered on the spot. It was very cleanly done, very cleverly done. The other redoubt was a very messy deal with dead Americans, dead Frenchmen, and, you know, but Hamilton got his glory there at in Yorktown, taking that redoubt. So that ended Hamilton's, it doesn't end, I'm sorry. It ended for a while, Hamilton's involvement with the Continental Army. And of course, he left then to go to New York and be a lawyer and have a lot of kids with Elizabeth Schuyler. And then, so what had happened was, I have to tell you two more stories. On November 25th, which happens to be the day I got married the first time. It's known as Evacuation Day, and Ira was there when I was married. But that was Evacuation Day in New York, the day that the British actually sailed away from New York, the last moment, and Washington came marching down. Now, he had let go of the whole army. There was no money to pay them. And there had been a mutiny up in Windsor, New Windsor. So there was just a few hundred men left. Washington came down. It was a glorious day, November 25th. And then a couple of weeks later at Fraunces Tavern, which is still with us, he brought in his officers to say goodbye to them because he was, you know, cashing in. And all he really did is make a few comments, and then he started to cry. And they all started to cry. It was a cry fest there in the long room at Fraunces Tavern. And they hugged and they cried, and that was the, you know, that happened in early December. Then Washington went down to Annapolis to the Continental Congress to hand in his commission and resign. And I think it's in your handout. He makes a speech, Washington, there in Annapolis, as he's handing in his commission. Here it is. And he says, I retire. I take my leave of all the employments of public life. Now, that's what he meant. That's it. I'm gone. And by the way, there in Annapolis, on December 23rd, he cried again. And everybody cried in the whole place with him. So Washington cried on Fraunces Tavern. He was a little, you know, very emotional that he had been through all of this death and it ended in victory. And he was leaving this phase of his life, camaraderie. He never wrote about it or anything, but, you know, it was goodbye. And anyway, later on, when they wanted him to go to Philadelphia to be the president of what we now call the Constitutional Convention, Washington said, especially to Madison, how can I go? I said, I'm retiring. Look what I said. I said, I leave all the employments of public life. I said goodbye. I'm a man of honor. I can't, you know. Madison became very close to Washington. Madison was unmarried, lived nearby. Madison ended up spending 10 different multi-day overnights at Mount Vernon. So Madison was inside the house at Mount Vernon, and he said, oh, forget about what you said. You must come. Otherwise, everything you worked for is going to go down the drain. So Washington gave into it, and, you know, the rest is history. They formed the Constitution. They elected him president. Now, by the way, when they arrived down in Mount Vernon, the guy arrives after they had counted the electoral votes for the first time unanimously for Washington. The only thing that Washington does is he gets on his horse the next day and rides down to Fredericksburg to tell his mother what happened. There's no friends and neighbors coming over with champagne or Madeira wine. The only thing he does is to see his Meshuggah mother and say, I became the president. So that shows, you see, how he didn't have any close friends, because he doesn't celebrate with anybody, or doesn't even, whatever you want to call it, celebration, whatever you want to say. So that's the last time he saw his mother as the president-elect. And then, of course, something else happens. He becomes the president. I'll go very fast forward. He goes to the great financier, Robert Morris, and says, why don't you be the Secretary of the Treasury? And Robert Morris says, I'm too busy. Pick Hamilton. And Washington had no idea that Hamilton knew anything about financial affairs. But he goes with Robert Morris. He picks Hamilton. And, Hamilton became a great Secretary of the Treasury. Now we'll fast forward again, because there's a little more to the story. He gives up the presidency. He didn't want to be president. He wanted to be commander-in-chief. But they forced him to be the president. He became the president. And he said, okay, 4 years, that's enough. I'm out of here. But they said, no, both sides. Jefferson said it. Hamilton said it. Madison said it. No, it's too soon for you to leave. And he had written out, Madison had drafted his speech. But then after 4 more years, the second term, nothing would stop him, and he left. And Adams becomes the president. And then something happens called the Quasi-War. Revolutionary France, they demanded payment of all their loans from the United States, and there was a big to-do about that. And then they sent this ambassador, Genet, Citizen Genet, who appealed to public opinion. It was a little crazy. So there was a thing called the Quasi-War, where the French Navy was, capturing American boats, and it was a nasty time. And then there was a fear that the French would invade. And part of the fear was that the French would invade and then free the slaves and get the slaves to join into this revolutionary situation. So President Adams, without really working out the details with Washington, reappointed Washington to be the commander-in-chief. And Washington said, well, I'm only going to do it if you appoint Hamilton to be my second in command. So Adams did it. Now, Hamilton had only been a colonel all of those years in the Continental Army. Like the other guys at headquarters, they were colonels, which is a nice rank, but it's not general. Now, for the first time, Alexander Hamilton became a major general. And he was very happy with that and rode around. And it was a little fearful to guys like Jefferson, because they were always scared of, the democracy, the constitutional government was, might be, they were always scared of a standing army. And there was Hamilton, Washington really stayed in Mount Vernon, and there was Hamilton riding around. But Adams, in his one achievement, cooled the situation with the French. And then Napoleon took over in France, and he brought stability to France. So they stopped seizing our ships, and Washington this army wasn't really the Continental Army, but it was the army. They both resigned, and then, of course, shortly afterwards, Washington died. But so his service, to summarize it, Washington enjoyed the camaraderie of his fellow officers, and they appreciated each other, Hamilton and Washington. Hamilton famously, when he was, had an affair when he was the Secretary of Treasury. And he was really being attacked. This affair with this woman, Maria Reynolds. And right at that moment, Washington and Martha sent over a beautiful silver tea set, which is on display, I guess, at the Grange, but, as a sign of his support for Hamilton. So they weren't close like father and son, but they had a wonderful working relationship. And, they were great. They sacrificed a lot and suffered a lot. They're two veterans that we can appreciate on Veterans Day. Anybody got a question? He did go there. He did go, and he raised a strong army, but he managed to end it very mildly. There was no clash. The rebels gave in, and I think he pardoned the leaders. There was no clash. He did lead it though for a while. And then he turned around and left it to his subordinate. Yes, sir. No, the French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, that was over. The British had first, they sent an army under General Braddock. This is how Washington really, one of the things that made him very famous is that Braddock got massacred by the French and the Indians as they stupidly marched along with their red coats. And so then it was a terrible scene, and Washington, who had been on a wagon with a terrible like dysentery, he was disabled. When he heard what was going on, he rose up, got on his horse, and was on horseback for like 24 continuous hours. And he rallied the Virginia soldiers and the British soldiers in organized retreat. And, he got a lot of applause for that back in Virginia. But then the British, they never give up. They sent another army under Forbes. But by that time, the British always had the population. The French didn't have the population. So the French realized the jig was up. And they left Fort Duquesne, which is really Pittsburgh. And so there was no big battle. The French and Indian War was over here. It was all timed together. That was it. Martha was now going to be his wife. She was rich. And it's not so much, some people think, he wanted her because she was rich. I mean, his older brothers, Lawrence married a rich girl, and he had another half-older brother named Austin, and he also married a rich woman. But Martha was, she's kind of underappreciated, Martha Washington. But nobody ever criticized her. She only got compliments all the time that she was the wife of the commander-in-chief, the first lady. She wasn't the flashy lady, and of course she was very short. Washington was over 6'2", and Martha was only 5'9", so it was a little awkward. But he loved Martha, and he was going to start his new life. So he had enough of his men, but none of them became his close friends afterwards. After years being there, because I don't know, he just was that way. Not a guy who made close friends. Yes. Well, Maybe he was. I don't. Washington was close to some of his aides de camp. There was one named Tench Tilghman, especially, but others of them knew how to relate to Washington, kind of in a subtle way. You know, they appreciated him. Listen, he was loved by his officers. Knox named his first son George Washington. Lafayette named his first son George Washington. Greene named his first son George Washington. And John Quincy Adams named his first son, instead of naming him John after his father, John Adams, named his son George Washington Adams. So, you know, respect. More than respect. They loved him. Oh, there's one thing I've omitted, and that is the Society of the Cincinnatus. You know, they give Knox the credit for the idea, but I kind of feel that it was Knox and Washington. And it exists to this day that the officers, the descendants of the officers, or the certain designated heredity individuals, basically men, it's all men, and they meet regularly, the Society of the Cincinnatus, to continue the camaraderie of soldiers. Yes?
You mentioned Hamilton had a great role in the artillery part of Trenton, but you didn't mention Henry Knox. Was he not the general that was in charge of the artillery?
He was the general in charge of the artillery, but he wasn't actually there, you know, in back of the cannons that I'm aware of, you know. I don't know that part. I know Hamilton was there, but there were two of them. You see, there was one all I know is one was top of King Street, one was top of Queen Street, and, you know, so it, I don't know exactly where Knox was. Well, you have to remember that Knox only had injured to it. He got an injury to his hand. I don't know if he had 2 or 3 remaining fingers. So, and he, you know, he was an overweight guy. So, you know, the actual meat and potatoes of working the cannon. Yes. Yes, he was. Well, you know, it's wonderful. It's amazing. And, you know, but I mean, of course, they got experience immediately. You know, I mean, that was a remarkable achievement that Knox, I think with his brother, got those cannons, you know, like in the winter, very heavy cannons. Okay.
All the way from the Berkshires, frozen lakes.
They repeat that path of the cannons. I think they have a hike or something, or some kind of an event to commemorate it. But Knox, you know, retired to Maine. So he wasn't, I mean, he became the Secretary of War, and then, you know, he kind of, yeah, well, he was Secretary of War, but, you know, he didn't retire to New York or Philadelphia, far away Maine. So, you know, what kind of diminished. No, I wouldn't say that. He's certainly, there's no criticism of Knox. He's well thought of, and he was right there. So he was a veteran that we should remember too. Okay. Thank you all for listening. Happy Veterans Day.